Hello and welcome, everyone. It's Bruce Calder here, VP of Consulting here at Claigan. Now, I'm going to be talking EU medical device regulation output for restricted materials, not for the whole medical device regulation, which is a bit of a beast. I'm going to talk about practical approaches for the restricted materials side. A lot of people get caught up in different parts of it. I'm going to try to be as practical as possible. A lot of stuff today. I'm going to be probably speaking at Mach 2. I'm going to apologize. On the bright side, it's going to be recorded. So when I mumble or speak a little too close together or just gloss over things or say something a little bit oddball, don't worry. It'll be recorded. And you can try to figure out what I said later. So everybody who registered will receive a copy of the presentation, but we'll also put on our website a recording. Hopefully it won't take us too long, where you can re-listen or send it to someone else or anything you like. But today's going to be a ton. It's theoretically 50 minutes. Good luck on that for me. But the idea is to stay under an hour total. There are a lot of slides because I'm talking about a lot of different things. It's necessary to be technical and specific and have pictures and details like that. So that sucks up some space and time. So I'm going to talk a little bit of EU MDR. It's a bit of an overview. After a bit of an introduction. Then I'm going to talk about 10.4.1. I'm going to talk a little bit about the degradation product section. People tend to forget about that. And then go right into CMRs and EDCs, carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxins, and endocrine-disrupting chemicals. That's why they have acronyms. Then I'm going to talk specifically about estrogenic endocrine disruptors, give you some idea. A lot of people are getting hung up on the endocrine disruptor portion. What's an endocrine disruptor? I'm going to try to be practical and specific. And then we'll talk about some common approaches. And we always like to start with outputs first. We don't start with inputs. We start with outputs. What are you going to make at the end? Okay, cool. Now what's going to go into it? Because we don't like, a lot of companies are getting stuck in the fact they're looking at the inputs instead of looking at the output. Actually, most companies are looking at the input. Look at the output. What's your output going to be that you can hand over to a notified body? Awesome. How do you get there? Then you look at your justifications. If you do have a substance above 0.1% by weight in the invasive or gas or fluid path, there you have to justify. And there's a new guidance out, justification, which I'm going to gloss over, unfortunately at epic speed. But I'm going to talk about the justification guidance for phthalates, the draft version. Talk a little bit about labeling and then Q&A. So if you have any questions, try to submit it in the questions section in the panel, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. If I don't get to yours, please feel free to contact me afterwards and I'd be happy to help. So we do lots of everything. EU MDR, of course, is one of the things we do. We have laboratory and consulting services on pretty well everything in this space. In particular, with the medical device regulation, the MDR stuff, it overlaps things like REACH, SVHC, and ROHS very strongly. So some strong advantages to do them at the same time. One of the big things is we focus on end deliverables and compliance. I mean, you're doing this to be compliant. You're not doing this for fun or amusement. You're doing it to be compliant so you can sell your product. So we have to, of course, focus on compliance. But above and beyond that, we'd like to focus on what the deliverables are. What you're going to produce at the end of the day. Focusing on that, what do the inputs have to be? We don't do inputs first. We look at the output. What's the output? Okay, what's the best way to get to that output? And if something doesn't contribute to possibly getting to that output, then we cut it out. So one of the things when we talk about this, you'll see we're going to start with outputs, then work backwards. So the EU medical device regulation, most people know, was published in 2017. It's got a wide range of changes and updates and many other details around medical device compliance, conformity assessment, safety, and all these kind of things. Included in it are some restricted substance or restricted material justification and labeling requirements, and that's mostly what we're going to talk about. It's in effect, more or less, May 26, 2020. The reason I say more or less is if you're still operating under a valid medical device directive, MDD, the current or previous medical device legislation in Europe, it's still valid until the certificate expires with some limitations. But in general, it's still valid until expiring. So 2020 for new products and for things that are coming off certificate. So historically, for restricted materials, the medical device directive had no restrictions for specific substances. They had some labeling requirements for latex and phthalates, and they did have the degradation products section to a certain extent. Things can't come off the device and cause harm. But there's no really restrictions or justification requirements for restricted materials. like lead or phthalates or that kind of thing. So we're talking mostly section 10.4. We're going to go into 23.4 a little bit, which is more the warnings and instructions for use type stuff. We're mostly talking 10.4, which is around substances. It's not the best written piece of legislation ever, and I'll go into that. But there's at least some good parts to work from. So a lot of what we're going to focus on is 10.4.1, the design and manufacture, which really should have a 10.4.1A and B. That would make a lot more sense, and I'll show you why. But we're going to talk about all of these. We're going to talk about the design and manufacture, the justification, the guidelines, in particular on phthalates, to justification, and labeling. When you come out of all this, what's the labeling requirement? Okay, so one thing not to forget, the design and manufacture section has almost like a run-on sentence, two separate and distinct requirements, which I think should have been A, B, 10.4.1A and B, but they didn't do that. It's just one big run-on sentence basically in this section. The first part is devices shall be designed and manufactured in such a way as to reduce as far as possible the risks posed by substances or particles, including wear, debris, degradation products, and processing residues that are released from the device. And there are a number of ISO standards, and what this is more around is, imagine you have a catheter with a Teflon coating. The Teflon coating flakes off and goes down the vein or artery, starts blocking things. That's a problem. So it's not really a lead or phthalate issue. It's just stuff come off and cause harm. And the most common recall type of this would be, say, peeling from Teflon would be an example. Teflon is nonstick and doesn't like to adhere to things. So it can flake off and go and cause harm. And that's what this is about. There's a number of ISO standards, and if you don't have one, some of the best tests actually, and you'll see this come up a lot in the medical device regulation. You'll see it a little bit later in justification. A lot of the more modern tests are actually food contacting. They have a lot more test evolution on things like overall migration. Overall migration is a fancy word for stuff that comes off. But you'll also see for the justification section, and if you read the guidance, you'll see a disproportionate amount of the references in the justification section refer to food contacting tests, which are generally a little farther ahead or a lot farther ahead on materials migration. So this one is just about stuff that comes out. It doesn't necessarily mean carcinogens or reproductive toxins. It means stuff can't come off and cause harm. And a good example being things like Teflon peeling off and going down somewhere important and blocking it up and doing that kind of thing. So the number of ISO standards for a variety of different things, but this is something you have to take into account because this is something that can cause harm and it will cause a recall. If you have, example, the Teflon problem, or there's a number of other materials that flakes off or goes and causes harm, this is going to be a problem. This is not, it's in the exact same section as the carcinogens. It's just not directly related, and there's no separation between the two. So when we talk about 10.4.1, we have to talk about both parts. Really should be an A and B, but they didn't write it that way. So this is the one people focus on mostly and often forget about the previous one. Devices are those parts thereof, or those materials therein that are invasive and come into direct contact with the human body. Invasive is such a wonderful word. They probably meant surgically invasive, but they didn't actually define it anywhere. I'm going to bring that back later, and how to handle it in practice. To administer or re-administer medicines, body liquids, or other substances, including gases from the body, so transport of fluids or gases into the body, and the other one is transport or store. So medicines, fluids, or gases. So things that are invasive or touch gas or fluid that will eventually go into the body. If they contain one of the following substances to concentration about 0.1% by weight or 1,000 ppm, you only can contain it where justified. And this is category 1 CMRs. Category 1 is known to cause. 1A is known to cause in humans. 1B is known to cause in animals. Category 1, carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive toxins, which we'll talk about, and endocrine-disrupting chemicals, EDCs. It does not include bioaccumulants. So if you look at the REACH SVHC list, the biggest delta between this list and the REACH SVHC list are the bioaccumulants. Bioaccumulants are things that build up in the environment to the point that cause harm. Those are restricted or regulated under REACH SVHC. They're not regulated here. Bioaccumulants aren't here. So we're looking at things that cause harm to humans. Carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxins, and endocrine disrupting chemicals. If they do, they're not banned, but you have to justify them. And you actually have to label them also, which we'll get into. So CMR list, carcinogen, mutagen, reproductive toxin as category 1A, known to cause in humans, and 1B, known to cause in animals. Roughly 2,000 substances, depending how you count subfamilies overlapping EC numbers or chemical numbers. So there's a lot of complexity. Chemical numbers aren't necessarily what you think they are. Most chemicals don't have to be pure, or they can represent a family, or there's multiple ones for the same substance. So, and then a number of things are listed as families or groups. So it's not as simple as you think. This is also, if people try to do full material declaration, which is a great way to get a recall for yourself and spend a lot of money doing it, a lot of things get hidden inside EC numbers. So it's harder than you think and more complicated, and it's not a simplistic thing. And that's why the actual list varies depending on how you define things. It is officially classified. So these are all substances that are officially classified. So you don't have to theorize whether it's category 1A or 1B. They would have been classified. Endocrine disrupting chemicals. There's a lot of potential. There's a lot of competition lists for potential endocrine disrupting. Say, hey, we got this list. Most lists, virtually all, are people theorizing. Officially, there are only 2 official lists, and they're one plus the other. The REACH SVHC endocrine disrupting chemicals. So there are only 2 ways to actually be an endocrine disrupting chemical. People can theorize as much as they want. Believe it or not, the polishing agent to your dishwasher tab is an endocrine disruptor in scientifically, but it's not categorized as so. Therefore, it is not. So there's only 2 official lists. So this is a medical device regulation. It's only official lists. So we're looking at the REACH SVHC endocrine disruptor substances that are classified through the REACH SVHC process as EDCs or through the biocide. Now, the biocide one hasn't classified really any yet, and if they do, they're going to be antibacterial type stuff like silver nanoparticle. So you're looking at really antibacterials. So outside of antibacterials, we're just looking at REACH SVHCs. Currently, all classified, officially classified endocrine disruptors are REACH SVHCs. There's a couple of biocides going through right now through a review process. They're all silver or silver variants. They're all antibacterial coatings. But other than that, the only ones classified, so the only ones officially endocrine disruptors are REACH SVHCs. And those are all one family. They're all estrogenic. They cause the body to be more female or have an estrogenic response. They're all one type. And they're officially classified under REACH SVHC. So CMR list is always very interesting and exciting. It's the official classification. They have to be officially classified as a category 1A or 1B in Europe. The endocrine disrupting chemicals today have to be through the REACH SVHC process. You'll get some antibacterials coming through the biocides process. Right now, we're looking just at REACH SVHC classified endocrine disruptors. So endocrine disruptors, phthalates are one. They're endocrine disruptor. They're also reproductive toxin. You'll see a lot of endocrine disruptors are also co-listed as reproductive toxins. All of the classified endocrine disruptors today are estrogenic. They create a female response. In so doing, they also bring down the sperm count of adult males. You make an adult male more female, their sperm count goes down. Not a big shock, really. So they often get classified as also reproductive toxins. So there's a lot of overlap between the endocrine disruptor list and the reproductive toxin list. Now, there are 2 groups of endocrine disrupting chemicals, of which every single classified one today are estrogenic. The thyroid disruptors can be the next group, like your dishwasher tab, like the vulcanization agent in rubber tires, the 2-MBT and ethylene thiourea and all those. They are not classified as endocrine disruptors yet. So there will be a second family called the thyroid disruptors. They create hypothyroid. In low concentrations, they create hypothyroid, which by preventing the formation of the T4 enzyme. Hypothyroid comes from a very specific chemical interaction. Those aren't classified yet. So wonderful, great scientifically, neat knowledge. Doesn't matter for MDR right now. It's only the estrogenic ones. Every single classified one today are estrogenic. Estrogenic substances have a chemical structure similar to estrogen. Either they or their metabolite has a phenol, the active element of estrogen. And if I have more time, I'll go into detail. All currently classified endocrine disruptors are estrogenic. They have a response, or they trigger the estrogen receptors, and they create a female response. So males You make a young male slightly more female, they get a form of anxiety, which everybody else sees as attention deficit, but it's just a form of anxiety. And older males get lower sperm count. Not a big shock if you make a male slightly more female. The females get hyperovarian growth. Their ovaries grow too fast. And so the way they test it in rats is pretty easy. Attention deficit is a little hard to test in rats, but see how fast it runs away from you. It's not a really good test. So the two tests they use, and definitely see it all the time in the European data, is the male rat having a lower sperm count. It's pretty easy there. And the females, it's the ovary growth. So do their ovaries grow to some extra large size, usually 150%. And one of the outcomes of hyperovarian growth is ovarian cysts. So when you see a rise in attention deficit in males, you're going to see a rise in ovarian cysts in females. They're the male and female response to the same phenomenon. So these estrogenic endocrine disruptors are anything that's classified this way will have you regulated under EU MDR. And currently, all endocrine disrupting chemicals that are classified and therefore regulated under EU MDR are from the estrogenic family. And they all have a lot of similarities. The next group will be the thyroid disruptors, but they're years out. So the way the estrogenic one works is basically they have an estradiol-like structure, and estradiol is really doesn't actually make you female. It's like a key to a lock. It unlocks the estrogen receptor, and that creates the female response. These chemicals have a chemical structure similar enough to estrogen that they can jimmy the lock. Bisphenol A, the metabolite of DHP, etc. And we'll see bits and pieces of those. So typical ones. So these are not necessarily all classified. They're all going through the classification process. This might not be the best example right now because not all of these are classified. DHP is a classified endocrine disruptor. It's a very common low molecular weight plasticizer for PVC, neoprene, nitrile rubber, styrene, butadiene rubber, basically shoe soles. The phenol ethoxylates, octophenol ethoxylate or nonylphenol ethoxylate surfactants. It's how laundry detergent worked till about 2005. Bisphenol A, which people think about polycarbonate, but it's actually a very common antioxidant in PVC. It's usually more high concentration PVC than in polycarbonate. Octophthalate is not a classified one. This chart, unfortunately, is from a scientific piece, and they don't. Not every one of these is classified yet. Octophthalate is the main ingredient in chemical sunscreen, but it is not a classified endocrine disruptor, and therefore not regulated or EU MDR yet. Triphenyl phosphate is one of the main halogen-free phosphate replacements. Its metabolite has endocrine disrupting properties. It is in the review process to become an endocrine disruptor, but it is not either. And resorcinol is actually in review right now, very specifically, to be classified as an endocrine disruptor. So the first three are classified and are good examples. The last three are not, but they're all the same groupings. So today, it's only the classified ones. It's the phthalates, it's the ethoxylates, nonylphenol and octophenol ethoxylates, and it's bisphenol A. The others, even though they may have the properties, are not classified and therefore not regulated yet. You will see a lot of them regulated first under California Prop 65, actually. One of the reasons is Prop 65 has 1,000 times a stricter regulation on reproductive toxicity. So if you're estrogenic, you'll generally create some level of male sperm count problems, and therefore, with 1,000 times safety factor, you'll often trip the definition of reproductive toxin in Prop 65. So whether it's an estrogenic one like these or the thyroid disruptors like 2-NBT, they're likely to actually appear in Prop 65 very early on. So back into more practical things. That was kind of a bit of a meander through endocrine disruptors. Again, endocrine disruptors are only regulated on MDR if they're officially listed, and the only ones that are officially listed today are on the REACH SVHC list. There's no single consolidated list of EU CMRs. There's a number of classification documents, and then a lot of companies are, whether individually or as a group or medical association, try to make a list of CMRs that are applicable to medical devices. And each has their usability challenged and their gaps. My favorite is the most recent one I saw from the main medical device association. Doesn't have ethylene thiourea. It blows my mind. Ethylene thiourea is the main way neoprene's made. It's ethylene thiourea, manganese oxide, and zinc oxide, and it has quite a bit of ethylene thiourea to the point it creates an allergic reaction. It doesn't have to be, but it commonly is. One of the challenges going to a list, it's vulnerable to what a consultant thinks, what the government thinks. If you really want to know what things are used for, search for that chemical on Alibaba and try to buy it in bulk. Look at what the uses are. It'll tell you exactly what it's really used for. So instead of theorizing, go try to buy it. Especially on Alibaba, you can buy 10 tons of ethylene thiourea, and I'll say specifically what it's being sold for and what it's used in. It's really helpful for all these chemicals. So it's a great double check to whatever you're doing. Why don't you try to go buy it and see what's actually being sold for? And you'd be shocked. You'd be shocked how out of date a lot of data is also. So all of these lists have their usability challenges and their gaps. Nothing is perfect. Nothing can give you confidence in it. So one of the other problems is testing comprehensively is not possible either. There are too many CMRs to test properly. Most of them don't have enough test methods, particularly ones that have been validated. Try and do an inter-lab validation of all the chemicals involved is not feasible. And a lot of the test standards that you're used to are actually a little bit dicey on their own. So there is risk everywhere. Common plan in the medical industry is to review each material, create a risk. So what is it? What's the risk? What's the action or test required, which is not different than biocompatibility, by the way, and what's the result of that test? And it has to satisfy a notified body. One of their challenges is this is going to have to go from a notified body. They're going to look at it. They're going to want to see you've done a risk assessment, you have results, and then they're going to want to sample the data. So you have to take that in mind. And not everyone's going to be the same. You can have an auditor-to-auditor variation. They're also new at this, but even now you're probably used to an auditor-to-auditor variation on other things on the medical device side. So this is a very common example output. This is a fake product, and there are 5 materials in it. It's got a polycarbonate, it's got a silicone, it's got a PEEK part, it's got stainless steel, 2 different stainless steels. And what you also find is if you put a lot of your products together, the parts that are invasive, which we'll get into what we do for invasive, and fluid and gas contacting, the materials actually will have a lot of repetition in your products. So what is the material? What is the risk? So we have a risk evaluation, and then if it's high risk, what is the risk? So polycarbonate can have BPA in it. Will have 1,000 ppm? Virtually no, but it will contain BPA. And then a lot of this device, in this case, this is not super accurate, was sterilized by ethylene oxide. Ethylene oxide residue is a risk. Ethylene oxide is a category 1 CMR. Therefore, if you sterilize by ethylene oxide, you have to have solved that. And then it can say the stainless steel one, for whatever reason, it's not really possible, wasn't sterilized by ethylene oxide, and 465 stainless steel is low risk. But the 304 stainless steel was. So it says, here's the risk. This risk of BPA, and then the other ones are really sterilized by ethylene oxide. And then what's the action? Oh, we got tests for BPA. Whether you do or your supplier provides the data, or test for ethylene oxide residue. And there's usual tests for that. And you might have all done it in one test. So on the right, you have what the result of your action was. Each one passed, and here's the document that supports it. And you know what? They can often all be the same document. Like ourselves, we might test the entire product, or we might test everything but the ethylene oxide residue, which you've already tested for a medical device anyways, and that's a separate one. And potentially it says ethylene oxide results A, B, C. They could all be the same document. They all could be the same name. Doesn't really matter. So you want, what's the material? What's the risk evaluation? What's the action for that risk? And then did it pass it? Because they want to see if it, you're saying it has a risk, and then you did an action. What's the result of that action? And then what's the document that supports it? Because they're also going to want to show you've done the conformity assessment. What's your result? Show you've done the due diligence and work. And then they're going to want to sample it. They're going to say, okay, I want to see the BPA test result and the ethylene oxide results B, just to prove they exist. Okay, you've done the work. They're only going to sample the data. It's a typical thing. If you end up, you can't find the document, or it doesn't really apply to there's no peak in this one, you're going to have an action that you're going to have to resolve. Not atypical for any other audit type thing you do. So you really, what's the material? What's the result of the evaluation of risk? What could be in it? And then what's the action? What's the result? And then what's the document for the result? You're probably sitting there going, how do you do the risk assessment part? That's fair. Because and again, we don't start with inputs. We start with outputs. What is the output? And then work backwards. Because if you start working, I'm going to ask supplier data, I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing. Okay, why? What's it look like at the end? Well, I don't know. Well, don't start with that. Start with what it looks like at the end. What do you need to produce to the notified body or a part of your tech file? Awesome. Now work how to solve that. So that's why you see the output first. You're seeing things, well, they did a risk assessment. They haven't told us how they do that. Yeah, we don't start there. We start with the outputs. So we use a two-prong approach. One is a materials review. So theoretically, if it's got an accurate EU safety data sheet for a material, it's required to list all category 1 CMRs and all endocrine disrupting chemicals. They have to be listed there if they're above 0.1%, which coincidentally is the threshold. Sometimes the specification, stainless steel, doesn't necessarily come with a data sheet, could be a specification. So everything should be listed there. Sometimes they're also not available. We'll get into that. The other one is screening or testing. What's our testing results of the product or the part? Putting together, and not necessarily comprehensive, but screening through. And I'll explain why both to a risk evaluation. They come both ways. Both have gaps. The materials review has a gap, and the testing has gaps. And I'll explain both. They're very complementary. So theoretically, if you review safety data sheet or specification, the SDS should list all category 1 CMRs and EDCs. If it's a specification like for stainless steel, it should often provide composition information. What's the maximum allowable metals? And it can't have organics for a number of reasons. However, one of the gaps, they don't necessarily include all materials and additives. So if you have something inside a polymer, it might be invisible. Also, if you have the SDS for the base plastic, but you add things, sometimes things get missed. We find that when we test at the end, it isn't exactly what they expected, and there's something they missed. Often, because I don't think the medical device side, other than doing a biocompatibility test, has historically done a fantastic job at materials controls, especially additives. The other problem is they might not be available. The safety data sheet or similar may not be available. It could be a third-party part. It's not trivial. So you have to find a solution for this. The other one is screening or testing, where basically we want to determine the concentration, where the safety data sheets say we may have bisphenol A up to 0.1% by weight. Well, does it? Verification, is the results we're screening for agree with the safety data sheet? That's actually another problem we have, where it's a wonderful safety data sheet you have, but there's something different in the one you actually, it could be contamination, it could not be exactly the material you expect. The sheet you might have might be out of date. There's a lot of reasons. You might be pressing them on cost and they've changed things. This comes down to patient safety. So therefore, you can't just half-arse it. It's got to be done well, knowing there are gaps and nothing's perfect. There'll also be unknowns. You'll often have materials missing data or third-party materials, so on and so forth. This helps clean the unknowns, and we put them back in together. What screening is vulnerable to is missing unexpected substance uses, things people didn't theorize. Right now, using a variety of industry lists on what CMRs are and what. If we double check what things are sold for in Alibaba, they don't necessarily agree with the industry lists. Therefore, there's a possibility of something in there you wouldn't necessarily think to check for. But if it's a category 1 CMR, it should be on the safety data sheet. So it's doing both. It's not a perfect situation. It's feeding both into a risk assessment of what could be there. And testing might actually clear off that things are not there. But also identify there's a risk of being there. Phthalate screening is quite straightforward. The Fourier transform infrared spectrometer, you can see the peaks. You can't tell if it's a dangerous one, but you can see the phthalate peaks. It's simple screening. So in two-prong approach, it creates a more complete risk assessment, doing both. And it also allows, especially with the notified body, we did due diligence on it. We did two different directions to complement, to make it less likely we'll miss something. And it also makes it a lot easier to document for their review and sampling. So, supplier declarations, not normally used as a general blanket for EU MDR compliance. Oh God, don't. No due diligence, no risk assessment, and the supplier declarations have absolutely no standard of care. Like, do you have any EU MDR substances? No. Awesome. To what standard? So there's no real standard of care for this. And it's amazing how, and if they say, no, we don't, they get to keep selling to you. So there's a lot of motivations. Plus, a lot of times, it's amazing how few chemists there actually are in this industry. They don't really know. Especially if you press them for an answer really quickly. You have 3 weeks to answer. Yeah, it's going to go well. And it generally doesn't. The worst thing you can get is actually response most times. Because if they give you a response quickly, they probably just wrote off a response and sent it to you. National authorities also, in the case of restricted materials non-compliant, so documentation is awesome for conformity assessment, but if you're non-compliant, a supplier declaration in general almost always means nothing. This is really particular on SVHCs and more importantly, POP and ROHS. So a lot of the national authorities, not the medical ones, but everybody else, are used to doing low-cost suppliers for failures. Low-cost supplier all the time says, my supplier said it's fine. And they're like, yeah, that doesn't, did you actually test anything? Did you review? Did you do any due diligence? No, then we don't care. So realize supplier declarations can be part of conformity assessment. However, if you're non-compliant and you didn't do any due diligence on it, like testing, they don't care. Supplier declarations mean nothing. This is a big one for ROHS, by the way. We have never had an ROHS enforcement event where the supplier declaration mattered. Test data has always mattered. Self-reporting has mattered. Supplier declarations, my supplier said it's fine, has never, ever carried a weight in a non-compliant situation. So do realize that. You got to take into that account. Now, can supplier declarations be part of this? Yes, especially when you go, the risk is BPA. I want some proof that BPA is not 1,000 ppm. And they provide that. That is an action. That can be solvable action. It's specifically a solvable action. But in terms of blanket declarations, it doesn't hold any water. There's no due diligence, no risk assessment. There's no standard of care. That's a particular. There's no standard of care. So you ask if was any MDR substance, they say no. What's the standard of care? What standard is it done to? There isn't. There isn't any due diligence standard. It's not. It's mostly just lazy. And lazy is not a good plan here. Okay, a lot of people are like, one of the questions was, what do they mean by invasive? Well, you know what they really should do is have a guidance where they have a definition for invasive and they say what it is, because that would be cool. But they don't. Even the new justification one doesn't, which would be really handy. Did they really mean surgically invasive? Probably. It's so the devices are those parts thereof, or those materials. Somebody says, is the part level? It says material. So materials is the level that comes in contact, are invasive and come in direct in contact with the human body. What's the scope of invasive materials? There's no current guidance. So how do you handle this imperfect situation? By the way, imperfect should be the sort of catchword of compliance for MDR. It's imperfect, but you have to do the right due diligence. That's why you want to show the risk assessment. You did the proper things, especially get past the notified body. But something goes wrong because suppliers make mistakes. You can show your due diligence over it. So the practical approach, we include all materials in patient contact. Why? Well, virtually all Category 1 CMRs and endocrine disruptors, and all endocrine disruptors are already regulated. They're already regulated. You have to know for other regulations. I can count on one hand the number of EU MDR regulated substances that are not regulated under ROHS or REACH SVHC that are all likely to be in your product. It's like beryllium and a handful of others. So they're already regulated. So you need this information anyways. So you might as well do the patient contacts because you need it. 98% overlap between what's likely to be in your product and what's already regulated. You need the information already. So if you do find something, though, you can revisit the definition. Doing this review, you haven't committed yourself down a path. You basically say, hey, you know what? We found lead in the connector of a wire that lies across the patient, touches the patient body. Was that really invasive? And then revisit the definition at that point. And that's a big part of it. So we take the approach of all materials in patient contact. And it doesn't mean we've committed to that being the definition. Those parts are already regulated anyways. Why don't we be a little more expansive because we need to know anyways? And then if we find something, we can reevaluate at the time. And if you got a carcinogen or reproductive toxin in direct human contact, you might want to revisit that anyways. It's good to know. But it's already regulated. You have to know. It's not like it's good to know. You have to know anyways. Well, we don't know it's a phthalate in this tube that lies across the patient. We're not really sure it's invasive. Yes, but it's still governed by REACH SVHC for phthalates. You still have to know. So it's a lot easier that way. And then we can revisit it if we find something. If we don't find anything, awesome. And life's a lot easier. We don't have to argue about what's invasive and not. So back on the output, again, we're looking at the output. What's the best way to get to here? So we get an output where we have the materials, what's the risk, what's the action, and what's the solution. What was the answer for that action? And where's the document that the notified body can sample? I'll pick the first one and the fifth one and look at them. So if you do find something, it's not banned. You have to justify it. So you have to justify on an analysis and estimation of potential patient or user exposure, analysis of possible alternatives, what the substitutes are, and what the benefit risk ratio. So a lot of it is basically how much they exposed or buy it. Are there substances to replace it? If there's no, that's one thing. If there are substances to replace it, why can't you? For cost or benefit, it makes the tube more brittle. We're going to have problems when it's internal, etc. Why can't you? Are there substances to replace it? And then if there are, why can't you do it? So in the law, in 10.4.3, they're supposed to, by May of this year, they're supposed to have a mandate where the scientific committee is supposed to develop guidelines. Fortunately, they're way ahead, because this is only the mandate. Now you got to start to have guidelines by May 2020, which is really unhelpful because that's when it kicks in. And it's around the benefit risk assessment. So there's a draft version that's actually out in March of this year. It's the guidelines of the benefit risk assessment of the presence of phthalates in certain medical devices covering phthalates, which are carcinogenic, mutagenic to reproductive, CMR, or have endocrine disrupting properties. Only applies to phthalates, but it gives you it'll be the basis of all the others. It's not that phthalate specific, except for they look at, they talk about some tests, mostly food contacting, by the way, that are used for migration, basically patient exposure. And there's a link here, so with the slides afterwards, you can go to the link. So there really are 5 now because of the time frame and such, and I'm actually going pretty quickly. I'm not going to go into super detail. I'm actually on schedule, mostly because I'm probably speaking way too fast, and I apologize if I don't, my mother wouldn't understand me, actually. It's fair enough. We will be recording, and you'll also get a copy of the slides, and you can feel free to ask questions. The question section down there, please feel free to ask questions, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. But there is a guidance, and it actually has a huge series of steps, trying to be very specific, but it kind of summarized in 5 different things. You have to first find out if they're there, which most of this presentation is about that, the risk assessment, whether it's there. And there's actually a lot of details. A lot of what we just talked about is actually covered in a kind of hand-wavy way in the justifications. So the justification document doesn't just have, oh, we have it, here's the justification. It actually has part. You have to figure out whether it's actually there, which, strange enough, is what we've been talking about this whole way. It has to have an assessment of possible alternative substances or treatments. So what are the other options? I got phthalates. Can I use terephthalates? What are the other options? We don't have to do the treatment this way. We can do it a totally different way. Then once you figure out their alternatives, assess the alternatives versus phthalates. So it's interesting. You find it, if there are no alternatives, that's interesting. But if there are all alternatives, you have to identify it. Then you have to explain why they don't work as well as the phthalated version. There's a lot of different criteria you can use, but why don't they work as well? And it has to be balanced against the CMR and endocrine disrupting phthalates. So here's the exposure. Here's the problem. Here's the replacements. Here's the problems using replacement. Does it all, if you do the risk benefit on the balance of things, does it make sense to keep using the phthalates or not? So are they there? There are other options to replace it? What's the problems with the replacement options and the current ones? Then balancing all that, the exposure, the problems with the replacement, what's the benefit risk assessment? Why should you still be able to be justified to keep using phthalates? So in a perfect world, you know what the best justification is? You put it in a simulant. A simulant is a material or a liquid or fluid or whichever that simulates the exposure scenario. So artificial urine or saline or sweat or a food supplement for feeding tubes, etc. You run a simulant through it, and then the category 1 CMR is non-detect. It doesn't come out. If the material interest does not come out and there's no patient exposure, justification is really easy. The problem is if it does come out. And a good example is phthalates. Phthalates don't come out in acids. They don't come out in water. They come out in oils. So they won't necessarily come out. They won't come out in saline, but they will bleed out in food supplements, like Ensure or breast milk or anything like that. They'll just bleed right out. They'll come straight out. The other thing is phthalates don't come out in the acid or water in your sweat. They do come out in the sebum, the sweat oils. They bleed right out. You touch a handheld tool, you'll get, California is probably survives the best for quantifying. You'll get twice the daily exposure in one use of the handheld tool. That's how fast it comes out in the sweat oils. So it's very much what's a simulant? And in the justification document, they do talk about oils for phthalates because Phthalate migration is completely dominated by how much oil comes in contact, whether it's the sebaceous gland, the sweat oils in your skin, or food supplement like with oils in it. It will strip out the phthalates, but water does not. And so it's a big deal. What comes out? If nothing comes out, if you can show, you know what, it's there. Another example is you have a solenoid in the air path. It's got a plunger in the solenoid. It touches the air path. It's leaded brass plunger, but it doesn't come out in air. Lead normally doesn't come out too much out of brass into air. Then the justification is really easy because there's no patient exposure. The benefit risk assessment is there. It doesn't get into the patient. Risk assessment is pretty easy. Now, phthalates is a little bit trickier. And I'll show you why phthalate justification is a bit of a challenge. First of all, phthalates aren't restricted. They're orthophthalates. And the new ROHS restricted ones are all orthophthalates. They're a particular type. Ortho is the arms on both sides. Meta is one across. And para or tera is opposite side. Tera is like pterodactyl. Pterodactyl is called pterodactyl because it's a mirror image. It has identical arms on both sides. It's para or tera are interchangeable. They're actually basically different pronunciations of the same Latin root word. So ortho phthalates are same side. Meta is one away, and they normally don't see a lot of metaphthalates. And then teraphthalates or paraphthalates are opposite sides. So one of the main replacements for orthophthalates like DHP is the terephthalate. Now you look at it and going, okay, well, they're just gaming the system. It's just on the opposite side. It's probably just as dangerous. Well, that's an interesting part. Orthophthalates have a number of common replacements. The terephthalate is the most common. When we do testing for orthophthalates, we can see the terephthalates clear as day. They're the most common replacement by far. And the one with the arms on different sides, so DHP becomes DOTP. Dihethylhexyl phthalate becomes basically terephthalate. The trimelatates we see in medical, often because you guys will pay more. Totem is generally not as good as DOTP, but it is called a high-performance plasticizer, so it's often chosen. It's a combination of the orthophthalate and terephthalate. It's got all three arms. So what's actually dangerous about, I don't have a picture here, what's actually dangerous about the terephthalate, the orthophthalate, is it's not, DHP is actually not dangerous, but its metabolite, after you metabolize it by your liver, simulates estrogen and creates a phenol-like component, and that creates the estrogenic response. So it's not the DHP, it's a problem, it's a metabolite. Totem doesn't metabolize as much into the dangerous version, but does a bit. Also, Totem will normally have residual DHP because of the esterization of the trace phthalic anhydride. Lots of sciencey words, I know. So Totem almost always has a bit of DHP. And it really is a combination of the terephthalate and the DHP, the orthophthalate. DINCH is also relatively common. It's the exact same thing as basically DHPs, except for instead of a benzene ring, that double bond hexagon, it's just single bonds. And the last one is the adipates, also a high performance, i.e. expensive, replacement. And you notice they're all basically the same thing. So the adipate is the exact same as DHP without the benzene in the middle anymore. So you also look at them going, you know what? They probably all are just about as dangerous as each other because they're all really the same thing. It's just a matter of how long before science catches up. Well, that's a bit right and a bit wrong. So if you look at the no observable adverse effect limit for each one of those, DHP's got a 4.8, very low number. It's metabolite. It easily metabolizes into MEHP, which creates an estrogenic response. The long chain ones, DINP, are a little bit better, and that's why they're not as regulated as much, but they do still metabolize into some negative actors. Totem is about 20 times better, but Totem creates the same problem, whether because it metabolizes a little bit into the same dangerous thing or because it always has residual DHP, which does the metabolization into the dangerous form. But it is 20 times safer. And ignore the citrates for a moment. DINCH is again also 20 times safer, but it's got some challenges. The adipates are 40 times safer. Eventually, you get a kind of concentration of anything, it'll cause problems. And the terephthalates are 100 times safer. They don't metabolize in the dangerous form. So the fact that just different arms on opposite sides actually makes a huge difference. And it's because the DHP itself is not what's dangerous. It's its metabolite. After it goes through its liver, it creates a structure very similar to estrogen. Terephthalates don't do that. The other part about this is the orthophthalates, like DHP, are about $1,300 a ton. The adipates and Totem are about $1,600 to $1,800 a ton. They're often also labeled as performance plasticizer, so you'll pay more. Terephthalates are also $1,300 a ton. So they're actually nearly identical price, and their functionality is very similar. Adipates have a far superior temperature control range. They don't vary as much with temperature, but otherwise they'll have a lot of similarities. But the phthalates are much safer, and they're not more expensive. Now, the cheapest one of all these, by the way, is not DHP. It's DHP SCCP blend, the lovely banned persistent organic pollutant. It's like $600 a ton, and that's why SCCPs are super common in inexpensive materials. So if you have a twist tie on your device, 30% chance it's a recall issue due to SCCPs, just so you know. Because the way you get a really cheap twist tie is use a combination of DHP and SCCP as the plasticizer. It's half the price. But SCCPs are not regulated here because they're bioaccumulants, and therefore not an MDR problem. That's a different regulation, persistent organic pollutant, or in Canada, the Canadian Prohibition. Now, phthalate justification can be difficult because if you have a device where you have phthalate migration, basically has any oil contact, it's going to bleed. And phthalates are useless unless they're high concentration. So there's a lot to bleed. They'll bleed right out. Think of it as dye running, and they'll bleed right out into oils. So there's a lot of strong modern data of the phthalate metabolite. It's not the phthalate, it's orthophthalate. It's a metabolite. It's dangerous. Lots of data on right now. It's really easy to give it to a rat and see the negative outcomes. The replacements are really readily available. It's not like there's an availability or shortage of any of those replacements. The cost differences are not significant, especially if you go to terephtalates. Totem and adipates are a little more expensive, but not a tremendous amount. The terephthalates are virtually identical price. The safety, the only thing that makes DHP cheaper is if you use it with a banned substance. If you use DHP with short-chain chlorinated paraffins, it's half the price. It's a big cost difference, but you're using a banned substance anyways. And the safety replacements are far higher, in particular for vulnerable groups. Again, if you use a device that doesn't have exposure, in particular to vulnerable groups, justification is a lot easier. But getting a phthalate justification for anything with the phthalates come out is going to be extremely difficult. Just so you know. If you have an oil contact, chance, unless people are asleep at the wheel, the chance of getting phthalate justified is virtually zero. Now, even if you justify it, you still have to label it. So nothing comes out, it's perfectly fine, you've justified it. You still have to label the device, the packaging, or where appropriate on the sales packaging. This is like you used to have to put the DHP label on it for catheters and such and tubing that had DHP. Now it applies to all category 1 CMRs or endocrine disruptors. Anything over 0.1% by weight needs a label. You have to label the device or the device packaging or where appropriate the sales packaging. You also have to provide additional requirement if it's intended to be used for children or pregnant breastfeeding women or other vulnerable groups, which the funny thing is, most of phthalates, the vulnerable group is adult males, which is not usually vulnerable for most things. You have to put precautionary measures in the instructions for use, if applicable. This can be really exciting for endocrine disrupting chemicals and reproductive toxins because the instructions pretty well don't use it. So that's going to be exciting. So if you do have one, you have to label it, and if it's intended for a vulnerable group or one that could be vulnerable to the chemical, you have to also provide information and instructions for use on it. The instructions for use also have if you have any CMRs or allergens, you have to put any precautions in the precautions section. The allergens one's a whole other huge topic. Allergens used to be just latex. Now it's huge variety of potential substances. That's a talk for another whole webinar. But if you want something that is likely to have enforcement, if you create an allergic reaction and you didn't label it, you're going to be in a challenge. And unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, people are becoming more and more allergic to a larger range of things. So this labeling requirement, warning requirement, precautions requirement for CMRs and endocrine disruptors is going to be a work and a pain at times, but relatively set piece. The precautions for use related to allergic reaction, like people who might be allergic to silicone and titanium. We know a lot of people are allergic to those now. You have to put warnings in for it. So that's a separate part. So when you do the CMR, don't forget about the degradation products. Don't forget about the allergens. There are other requirements. So again, back to the output. You really want to create an output at the end and find the best inputs. We're a big fan of what's the materials, what's the risk, what's the action to solve that risk, if applicable, the low risk, and then what's the outcome of that action. So in terms of our services, of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit it. I apologize for the speed I'm going at. It's kind of a bit Mach 2. I was trying to stay on time. So we do lots of risk assessment testing for materials. We do risk assessment materials. We do lots of screening. We test dozens of devices every day for EU MDR and engineering evaluation. We do lots of this. Also, we do ROHS and REACH and POP and Prop 65, and we're probably one of the most commonly used Prop 65 lab because a lot of overlap between all this kind of thing. We can do more than one thing. One of the nice things about the MDR compliance is the substances are regulated elsewhere in ROHS or REACH SVHC, and doing them at the same time is very efficient. Saves a lot of money and solves a lot of problems. We also do a lot of training and education. I mean, this is a wonderful webinar and all, but it's only so technical. Some people might be going, well, it's kind of really technical. But what we also do is for EU MDR, building those tables, we also train people how to do it. Now, a lot of people just send the materials and have us do it or do a portion of it, which is also awesome. But often medical device companies send their engineers to us or regulatory people all the time, and we teach them how to do it. And we also have our lab here so we can show a lot of practical things. But sometimes if you have a whole bunch of people you want to teach, we come to you and we go over how you do data today, what's the best way to do the MDR compliance for restricted materials. So we can help you by doing it for you, or we can teach you to do it, or teach you to do portions, and you figure out how much you need us to do and how much you want to do yourself. Some people have time constraints. They're doing a bit of mix of both. They're training how to maintain it and do it going forward, and they use us to get a lot of their legacy stuff up to snuff. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to submit it there. Everybody who attended will receive a copy of the presentation, but also we should have a recording online in the next couple days, and you can download it there. I'll try to get to questions.